Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Decolonial Critic Lab. My name is Ali Asgar Tara. I use they, them, she, her pronoun. I'm a Bangladeshi transgender artist currently based in Brooklyn, New York. In my visual art practice, I combine video, text, drawing, and community performance to create political, site-responsive, and cross-disciplinary collaborations. This semester, as an artist in residence at the University of Connecticut's Asian and Asian Studies Institute, I am leading a regular encounter through the Decolonial Critic Lab, a bi-weekly meeting discussion designed to provoke critical connection between decolonial methods and how Asia has been constructed, represented, mediated, and conceptualized by artists, curators, activists, and scholars across the globe at the end of the 20th century and early 21st century. It is my great honor to invite Stephanie Hsu. Stephanie teaches and writes in the field of Asian American studies, queer and trans studies, and disability studies about the embodiment of race, gender, and desire. Raised Taiwanese American in the US South, Hsu is an associate professor of English at Pace University in New York City, a board member of Kyoung's Pacific Beat Peacemaking Theater Company, a recipient of the 2020 Community Catalyst Award from the National Queer Asia Pacific Islander Alliance, and an editorial collective member for the Q+Public book series with Rutgers University Press. Together, we will discuss desire and creative production among the Asian American community. Stephanie's presentation title today is Asian Anti-Black Racism, or How to be a Critic of Community-Based Cultural Production. I'm very happy to have Stephanie today on the Decolonial Critic Lab. And Stephanie, kindly thank you for agreeing to share your amazing scholarship with us, your experience with the community, your community organizing, and the creative production you're going to share with us today. Before spending more time talking, I will just request you to proceed into the presentation part. After the presentation and during the presentation, we can also talk about it, get some response, and after we finish presentation, we will have a conversation for about the topic. If you have any question, if you need help, I'm here to help you during the presentation. Thank you, Stephanie.
Great, thank you so much, Tara. I'm happy to be here and also to be a collaborator with you on a project I'll talk about later in the presentation. And I use she, her pronouns or all pronouns, and last name's also pronounced Hsu, but also I don't care. And here, let me go ahead and start with the press. I am inspired by a text that Tara and I discussed in connection with the Decolonial Critic Lab, which is Chen Guangxing's Asia as Method. And this is a piece I wanted to lift from that work. De-imperialization is theoretically a much wider movement than decolonization. And this I take to mean that the racisms that we know about from our colonial past should take up less of our labor than the new supremacies to come from our own imperial cultures and as people in the Asian diaspora. And so for me, I wanted to look at kind of 3 different texts with a lot of visuals with y'all and talk about like how to turn the tools of critique, kind of university sanctioned critique theory, critical theory, how to turn those tools towards our own communities, which raises for me 2 practical questions. That is, what is the place of whiteness in the role of allies? And what is the role of theory and the place of language? So I'll track those concerns through what follows. So I'm not a theater person, but I have had the privilege to be in New York since the late 90s for my own education and then my employment in higher ed, and very lucky, I know that. And I found myself working with people who are doing community-based and ensemble devised theater, even though I'm not a theater person. So here's one example of currently, I'm a board member with Kyoung's Pacific Beat, a peacemaking theater company based in Brooklyn, Flatbush. And we have presented in the recent past, this was from last year, a series of community engagement events in partnership with the list on the left here, GPEMNI, Communities United for Police Reform, the Blasian March, and the Exponential Festival. And the work in progress right now is called Nero, and it's a meditation on the George W. Bush presidency through the allegory or figure of the Roman Emperor Nero. And so this was an event that we had that premiered a little bit of the Zoom piece. I won't be able to show any live production, but I will stream anything, but I do have the costume lookbook, which I want to help us think about the visual aesthetic here to start. So this was a conversation about deconstructing whiteness using the example of this work in the ensemble of Kyoung's Pacific Beat, a group called the Mondragons. And each actor, as you'll see, developed a kind of relationship to their costume that attempted to deconstruct whiteness or interrogate internalized oppression in their own communities and cultural heritage. So the questions that we ask in connection with our coalition partners are, where and how do we see militarization at play within our communities? How do we activate our communities to demilitarize America and defund the police? And what storytelling is necessary to advance abolitionist work in our community? Storytelling is clearly the disciplinary reason that I'm there. Other reasons that I'm there are my dear friend Kyoung is the founder of this theater company who recently just took it to 501c3 status after being years of kind of a grassroots network of collaborators. So the aesthetic that is being explored and how to adapt Nero and George W. Bush to our time is for Kyoung, who is a kind of third generation, sorry, no, it's called third culture kid, who is Korean, born in Chile and now lives and works in New York. He was inspired by new Andean architecture, and had Jason been here today, this would have been a great touchstone for us, but this is a form of Bolivian architecture that is belongs to a rising middle class of indigenous or Aymara people of Bolivia who have made their wealth in recent generations, actually kind of since the Evo Morales presidency, the first indigenous president of Bolivia to claim indigenous heritage of Bolivia. So their wealth comes from commercial exchange with China. So there is a kind of middle class indigenous Aymara business community that goes back and forth, and their kind of sign of wealth is this cultural fusion. And let me stop sharing, switch over to the PDF where I can show you the lookbook. So based on this kind of idea of an aesthetic that doesn't reference the West, the costume designer in the Mondragons, Andrew Jordan, who is a white identified queer cis man, has developed this lookbook. So I'm just kind of flash through. And Tara, if you want to stop and say anything, please do. The look evolves through the acts. Kind of there's an initial meditation on the materiality of, the Roman Empire in the form of white marble, tracing kind of aesthetic of facelessness, corporate minimalism, inspiration from bell hooks here about the interlocking political systems that we should be thinking about. And here you see kind of how the lookbook is now blending inspiration and the heritage of the actors in trying to deconstruct a militarized look, the weaponization of our own cultures through colonization. And so this is a visual meditation on how to, I think, signify peace, which is the ultimate mission statement of this sort of work. So from there, I want to take you to the first publication that I was lucky enough to put out there, which was as a graduate student, as a result of going to a graduate student conference. So definitely go to conferences when you can. And here is the piece that ties Tara and I together now. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. I had an opportunity in 2008 to, as a grad student as well at NYU, bring the play that I had seen in the community and was then writing about to campus. So this was the promotional flyer, and the play had limited engagements in the city. We were able to kind of commission it. And at this performance, the asylum seeker who inspired the figure of Tara in the play actually attended our Q&A, and she's now a beauty technician in New York. So we were able to really see continuing relationships formed by this cultural production. And also want to highlight, you see the fine print at the bottom, how many sponsors it took, how many different departments saying we've got a couple $100. So all my campus activists, y'all keep it up. So the play initially was developed out of a community network through the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization with deep roots in American history, and also Queer Immigrant Rights Project, which, as I can tell, existed for just 4 years, but met monthly, and was an information resource sharing network from people who had received asylum and were applying for asylum because of that kind of isolation and legal confidentiality that attends these sorts of cases. It's really hard to find best practices or even find survival networks. And through this connection, the playwright Jeffrey Solomon developed a play with one of the queer network members. So this play was based on her life story. This is an image developed, by the American Friends Service Committee to kind of document this co-sponsorship moment. But in terms of supporting queer, I don't know why the organization was not sustained, but and it has very little in terms of being archived online. There's very little online. But so thinking about how these services were indeed supported, we don't know. But this is the kind of synopsis of the play. And this is a film still that kind of during a lighthearted rehearsal moment, but the figure on the left, the white woman, is Judith Bright, who you'll hear about. This is an excerpt from that essay, and I wonder if Tara might be able to read it for me. I'm struggling a little bit with cold symptoms.
Sure, my pleasure. In the attempt to retain her identity as a transgender woman in a gender-segregated detention facility, Tara seems to retreat into a commercialized gender stereotype and find comfort in her imagined relationship with Judith Bright, a middle-aged white actor who is a regular headliner in her favorite Lifetime movies, and who agrees to help Tara turn her life story about a, quote, girl who was mistaken at birth for a boy, unquote, into a made-for-television movie. Directed by Tara, Judith reenacts scenes from the former's childhood and youth in Guyana, and together they revisit a series of painful encounters with her abusers, played by other cast members, that involves the re-choreographing of Tara's violent memories into Judith's body. In one scene, for instance, Judith plays a 10-year-old Terence, who is being beaten by his father for a display of effeminacy, as they're grappling intensifies. Judith screams in surprise. This is not a stage fighting, and pleads with Tara, who is calmly watching the action off in the wings, to make an emergency change to the script. When Tara unexpectedly screams back, "You are going to tell me how to survive?" The subject positions of the transgender woman of color and the white liberal feminist, or the asylum seeker and the citizen, are suddenly reversed.
Thank you, Tara. And I'll just credit Emily Joy Weiner, who is now the leader of the Houses on the Moon Theater Company, produced Tara's Crossing, plays Judith, and Andre Chin, who is also of Afro-Caribbean descent, plays Tara. They're on the right in the Sorry. And one more slide for you to read, my dear.
Sure. After a performance of Tara's Crossing, a founding member of Queer asked me what I thought of the play, and he told me in return that he found working Solomon, who is a white gay male playwright, a little like the idea of working with Judith, onto whom Tara's experience of physical abuse is literally transferred, and in whom straight white audience could see themselves. And while some queer members failed to appreciate the element of fantasy that Solomon brought to Tara's story, all recognized that the most important product of their collaboration was the creation of allies both on and off stage.
Thank you for reading that. I want to kind of carry through this brand of liberal feminism into the next kind of moment, but I can't wait to talk about the play with you, Tara, if you want to after. Okay. Oh, something else that happened at the same time, again through community networks, and I think the story I'm trying to tell is that my research opportunities found me, and I actually related to them as opportunities to document what was happening in the community and community knowledge. And this turns out to be, my work turns out to be one of the few places you can read about queer in print. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, save flyers and realize that you don't have to go looking for research, it actually finds you. If you're doing the kind of research that I think is about de-imperialization. So let me play now, and you're looking at a blank screen, of a video that gives you the history of an organization that was founded around the same time called Q, which is an organization for queer women and trans people of API descent.
Q-Wave grew out of a series of conversations begun at the Queer Asian Pacific Legacy Conference in March 2004. This Pan-Asian multi-gender grassroots organizing event in New York City reinvigorated queer organizing from Boston to Philadelphia to DC. Here in New York, a basic but difficult question emerged for us. Why wasn't there a women's and trans-specific counterpart to GPEMNI or SALGA, two local organizations with decades-long histories of queer pan-ethnic community building? A few months later, while we were still mulling over this question, our community was called together again to protest Details Magazine's racist, sexist, and homophobic feature, Gay or Asian. With allies like GPEMNI, the National Asian American Student Conference, or NASCON, and the New York Association for Gender Rights Advocacy, or NIAGRA, we demanded a meeting with the magazine's editor-in-chief and won an apology in the next issue. Then 2 days later, on June 18th, GPEMNI and the Women's Caucus of the Queer Asian Pacific Legacy Conference hosted a workshop on gender and the API experience at the LGBT Center. The meeting called for breakout discussions about organizing around queer women's and transgender queer spaces for support and activism, along with a separate discussion for men to explore their role in supporting women's and trans organizing. A week later, on June 26th, a handful of us marched in the 2004 Dyke March for the first time as the core of what would become Q-Wave. We were lesbians, we were bisexual, we were trans women and trans men, we were multiracial, Filipina, Korean, Taiwanese, and Malaysian. We were immigrants and Asian Americans, and not all of us are here today. At our first meeting, we decided that we didn't want a space dominated by a single gender expression, political or religious viewpoint, or social hierarchy. We did want a space that was safe for queer-identified people of our shared racial and ethnic heritages, a space that recognized intersectional oppression, and a space that wouldn't one day become institutionalized. It took much longer to come to an agreement about our name, however. Some suggestions like pride and fierce were already taken or were soon to be associated with other movements. Some like power, Devi, self-love, and yellow peril were just too broad. And some like pink fire, sweatshops, and kumquat were, and still are, a bit confusing. The rest of 2004 flew by. We launched our website and threw our first holiday party at the LGBT Center. But this was before internet use was widespread, and the phone number we put on the flyer was probably Unjung's. With each passing year, our membership and our programming grew, as did our relationship with Gapimni and Salga, with whom we march every summer during Pride. We eat together, sing together, learn together, protest together, watch films together, and auction ourselves off to each other. In 2013, through the generous support of the Stonewall Community Foundation, we started planning the next decade of Q-Wave, a future filled with coalition work around our community's challenges and parties that celebrate our courage to love one another. In the past 10 years, Q-Wave leaders have helped to build more organizations of immense value to our community, including the Asian Pride Project, the Dari Project, Lunar New Year for All, and even Incapia, our hosts for this evening. Q-Wave's name reflects this fluidity and this potential for change, progress, and momentum. We thank you for this honor, and happy 10th birthday to us.
So that was actually the award acceptance video from when we were recognized for our 10th year anniversary, which was actually in 2014, which is truly an achievement because there has been a history of organizing by people assigned female at birth that gets kind of turned over as our leaders get pulled into other movements. I think that is evident in racial justice work across the board, social justice work right now in our country's history. But I wanted to kind of freeze frame this list of what we did want, what we didn't want at the time. Anecdotally, I would say we were mostly college educated, whether abroad, whether not in this country or in other countries. We had kind of a sense of intersectionality, if not the language. And here's the language part that I want to think through, because this organization, Q-Wave, has gone through all of the kind of cycles of liberal feminist exclusive discourse that we recognize. We went through a moment where we debated whether or not we were gonna, how broad our trans inclusion was gonna be. It was, this kind of turfy conversation where masculinity, we wanted to include masculinity like on a binary basis. Results of kind of being part of that community was we were able to reflect. And in this moment, I'm kind of focusing on the initial organizing flyer because there was a breakout group that wanted a multi-gender organization, kind of thought about, and then Tara, we can talk about Salga as well as a multi-gender organization that is explicitly South Asian. Q-Wave has always been truly pan-ethnic, and often people who identify as feminine or women from Salga will also be part of Q-Wave because there's a feeling that if you have a multi-gender space, it actually gets dominated by sort of cis male perspectives. So the difficulty in kind of launching a truly multi-gender, non-binary space is still out there. And that is part of why I wanted to really also celebrate this work that we're doing that for me is not academic writing, really. And Tara and I and our co-editor of the project with me, Kaman Say, this is Kaman's portrait of Tara. And we are putting together a book called My Race is My Gender. And this is a working title, but it does feature essays and portraits by and of non-binary people of color. Kaman has a process of taking the portrait or making the picture collaboratively with the subject that I would love you to talk about too, Tara. But here is kind of an excerpt from my epilogue, and I will again ask for your graciousness in reading it for me as by way of summation here.
From My Race is My Gender epilogue: Afro-pessimism, brownness, Asian androgyny, and other forms of non-binary race. A beloved of mine used to remind me that body's shape is one of my relative social privileges. In addition to being Asian while he is Black, I knew this to be true every morning. I helped him struggle into his chest binders through the freedom to breathe in one you can't feel until it's constricted. When he decided to come out as trans at work and to his family, I started identifying as genderqueer without changing much but my language, because association with the word I used then, such a lesbian or girlfriend, could cause him as my partner to be misgendered. Coming home later at night from queer parties in the bars and clubs, we would both slouch in our subway seat, throw wide our legs, and pull our hoods up, trying to blend in with Black, Latinx, and Asian man also headed home from closing time, or perhaps headed out for an early shift. Me and careful imitation of that masculine stone-like fatigue I recognized from growing up around restaurant workers, and out of care not to draw attention to the two of us because he had been chased down nighttime streets before, but also a little ashamed for being unlike all of them. There is apparently an ideal form of the non-binary body, even though the possibilities of being not man are expansive. The visible face of non-binary gender tend to be young, white, slim, masculine of center, or androgynous, educated middle class, and not disable. The identity is therefore more difficult or unwanted to claim the more a person sits outside of this privileged group. Meg Jones-Baker and Alex Lanterfield write in Life Isn't Binary 2019, page 77, the representative face of the movement would be me, but for one big reason. That's what it means for Asianness to be adjunct to whiteness, or its junior partner is a structural sense, even though it's a dubious privilege because not all Asian wants to be seen as androgynous, or misgendering can only partially name our injury, since racist stereotypes have overdetermined our gender appearance. Sorry, I stumbled a lot in this reading.
No, thank you so much for sharing the labor of reading with me. So that's just a bit of where, and Tara's never seen that before either, a bit of how the book is sounding by way of my, again, privilege of being kind of able to sum up what I found to be a consensus really about the specificity of anti-Blackness, and really our lack of relationship to each other because of the way that desire has always been routed through whiteness. And these are the kinds of difficult conversations that I want to be having with my community, as defined by a colonial past, of course, but more because I feel pulled into the future, and it's a dystopian future of, especially in my case, I'm looking at Chinese supremacy. And I found the work of Wen Liu really, really beautiful and important, and I'm happy to share that with you. They have an article called Complicity and Resistance about kind of Chinese American counter protests to the Black Lives Matter movement, or the movement for Black Lives, and that rhetoric, and about how kind of new mobile transnational, group of people are kind of adopting more conservative forms of rhetoric because they come from homogeneous racial and cultures. So the problem of how to read racial difference. I wanted to kind of then say that my relationship to language and the place of language and the place of theory that I asked before, also I have found that language actually wanes, disappears. The role of theory is to disappear into action. Because I have found, just kind of being now on the board of a theater company, when you are in a community and working together really on projects, you actually learn to apply your theory to make decisions. And so it's not like this is what Adorno would say. It's maybe you should make that font bigger, right? It's totally, the theory disappears in action. But then it looks like we are experts of institutions or experts of processes rather than experts in our field. But when you de-imperialize theory, I'm sorry, but I think that's what it looks like. And I am trying to do it, even though it has really messed up my writing, I guess. So I'm constantly looking for that next voice. And I have recently done a project where I interviewed a playwright friend of mine who was my friend for 20, 30 years. And in that interview process, I noticed we both assumed these voices, that really divided us, siloed us, the voice of the artiste and the voice of the critic. But, and that's again, a reminder to me that my language needs to change. And that's a sign that you're actually doing the work. I think so. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk. I know
amazing. These are very rich in terms of what you presented. There is multiple things I want to speak. I can go on and on about it to you. It's very wonderful, first of all, Stephanie, listening you speaking, giving the presentation, giving us this tour of the history, right? This is a historical tour of what has been happening in New York City, in Asian American, Pacific Islander, queer activism scene, the progressive scene, because often the idea of the model minority are like looking at Asian American community as this conservative community who doesn't have conversation around this topic, which kind of, this presentation dismisses many of those idea or preconceived notion about what community is, what community building is. Even like you mentioned, the Salga, like when my experience of going to Salga, I moved to New York 2 years ago. I started going to their party after the pandemic, like not after the pandemic is still going on, but I'm referring it like after like things are slightly getting back to normal. But things are mostly Bollywood parties and all this kind of other form of dialogue is happening, which are very necessary place to be and to hold. But also spaces like QWeb, which are more politically engaged, more progressive forward in coalition building with other communities, make sure they are not, the conversation is not lost in just the pleasure of party. And that's where the desire comes in conversation as well. I wanted to think about the last slide you have presented, because that's your recent project. And I'm also have a little bit contribution on that project. So I'd like to start with that in our conversation. What you have told on your preface about the non-binary identity, which I agree 100%. I have no way to disagree. Like when I identify as a non-binary person or a trans person, often the questions comes back to me. It's not all often the questions. Many times it's the assumptions comes back to me that I'm faking it. I'm literally saying it for the first time on record. Many times I feel like people are giving me this assumption or like suspicious kind of question and all this kind of investigative mode that, oh, you are faking it for some social capital or something like that. So my body is not believable to be on that identity. So I really love that the quote and the way you articulated the challenges of being a non-binary person when you are not inhabiting a white masculine twink or this predominant presence of a non-binary body in social media, in TikTok, or on your day-to-day life. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit behind your idea of like writing that text, and what was your experience in community building, how non-binary as an identity emerged, or androgyny as an identity emerged in front of you. You talked a little bit about it on the text, which we both seen, that being an Asian is automatically you are kind of categorized into androgyny sometimes by default, but you never have to struggle to be on that identity spectrum. So if you can just speak a little bit more, that would be lovely.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for sharing that. I mean, we've talked about that, but on the record, that's so powerful. And that I think we need, okay, so first of all, we need more texts, more stories, more personal accounts out there. Ari, one of the contributors to our book, they said like, if this book had been on my library shelf in my high school, I could have taken it off the shelf and proven to people that I'm real. And just thinking like, oh, we missed that by 10, 20, we missed that by however many years. So there's something about, yes, we need more documents out there, but I also want to underline that for me, like the perversity of white supremacy can be seen in the fact that what is anti-Asian discrimination, a kind of gender indifference that we, that as discrimination is kind of like exactly the kind of recognition that some of our most precarious, gender subjects need, right? They like trans women of color would I complain about not, I can't complain about passing. So anyway, I'm thinking about how our knowledge of how gender works in the world is pitted against each other. Again, a lack of relation, and admitting that, right? Admitting that my gendered experience is at least my gendered experience is easier in the world because of my race. While other community members would take that same kind of social existence and say that it was demeaning to them for the same reason, not recognizing their gender. This predicament I really want to put in conversation with the idea of anti-Black racism also being so intense and gratuitous that it erases gender with the force of racialization as well. So I want to think about those treatments, and again, how we relate to, how all of our genders are funneled through a kind of, repulsion from Blackness, right? From the Black body ultimately.
Yeah, definitely. And I, again, going back to my personal experience, have someone who is very dark skinned, and you're talking about passing. And many times I feel like I grew up in a culture when passing more in proximity to whiteness is something for your credit, right? So I don't know how it is in the East Asian community, but obviously in the South Asian community, that's the culture I grew up until I moved to America. And after moving to America, I realized that I pass more closely to the Black community, to the Afro-Caribbean community, right? And that passing makes me feel more grounded in my own body, makes me more confident with my own body. Obviously, I'm talking about in the context of New York City and the Brooklyn, the area I live or navigate mostly. That can change depending on where you're going. Like I just came back from Florida, and I felt like, so after like 2 years, I felt for the first time only Black person, only dark skin looking person in public spaces. And what does that do to my body, my gender expression? I'm a person visibly trans, Black, not Black, dark skinned person, South Asian, who is out in the public spaces and the beaches, and like the pleasure is very connected, right? So I'm going there for pleasure. My desire is playing a role, but also I feel kind of surveilled all the time, not necessarily through the mechanism of the system of the space, but also mechanism of the racial structure, right, in American landscape. So that's something I want to add with you. I also want to connect our conversation with the Tara's Crossing, which is a very important cultural discourse, cultural production for me, not because how much I can connect through my own experience, because I'm also an asylum seeker. I came to this country as Tara's narrative explains. And I love that last line on that when Tara is shouting back to the producer, a white woman, that this is my narrative, I should have agency on my own narrative. Like how many times we have seen the agencies got lost, like someone else is claiming the agency. And I talk a lot about in my work, who owns the suffering, the queer suffering. Is it the queer people who have the ownership of the suffering versus the people, the ally, the making of the ally? And on the second slide on the text, we see, if we can go back sometime, that it's
I can share it.
The some of the audience members have opinion. The best thing this production did is making those ally, right? So it's
Oops. Let me try again.
So I wanted to mention these points, like this making of ally through a cultural production, representation of this experience of the queer asylum seeker, which often you will see is not very presented, discussed in the mainstream cultural production or queer cultural production, because there is internalized shame also associated with it, because you're abandoning your homeland, or for your not only economic opportunity, for your sexual opportunity, perhaps you're coming into a different land and inhabiting that different land. What do you think, how that contrasts to the idea of de-imperialization, when queer bodies transnationally traveling through the land, moving into different country? And this is a very relevant conversation in my life every day. Even today morning, I had some conversation with someone who I have to suggest, like, oh, what they should do with their life. Someone who lives in like many of the places which are anti-homosexual, they don't have the right to express or perform their desires, and they're coming to this imperial land we call America for freedom. Then how the contrast dynamics between like where you find your freedom versus what that land is known for imperialization.
Yeah, like first world rights, right? Well, first of all, I think that it's so beautiful that you, and if I may, you know, in your story, people question that you're non-binary at the same time that you have to document a story of suffering. And that's similar in Tara's situation too. The legal structure doesn't recognize that her subjectivity exists, but we know that gay men are eligible for asylum from Guyana. So why don't you just, you know, why doesn't Tara just pass as that for the legal proceedings? So the idea of passing and believability and what people will believe and what they won't versus what we need them to believe is very interesting. And it always casts the non-binary position as the kind of snowflake subjectivity, right? Because, you know, what are you complaining about? But I think that in spite of that accusation of voluntarism, it's a profound resistance, and it's a flexible one. It is as mobile as our psychologies are, as our survival and coping skills are. And I think we're at the time where we need to admit that, and we just say, like, we survive for each other. And then what are we going to do in this new community of non-binary people? We're not just like a new variety. We are going to turn ourselves into thinking about how our genders come from anti-Blackness. And I really think that a lot of non-binary writers and artists and activists who believe they have a social justice calling, I think that's what they're looking for, even though it seems, you know, just kind of non-committal. But that's the politics, right? Like we have to always be floating.
Yeah, no, definitely. I totally agree with you. Non-binary is more of a political identity, a way of living life, rather than that homonormativity, the kind of assimilation. You're rejecting the assimilation. I am rejecting the assimilation, that I don't want to assimilate. I want to have our individuality. I want to stand against. So I agree with you how non-binary kind of close in conversation with the Black community and suffers the same kind of resistance from the whiteness because of the non-normativity. If you can allow me to use the word non-normativity in a sense that what bodies are designed to be fall under the certain criteria, and what bodies are excluded depending on that criteria. But going back to how you started the conversation with the quote
Can I say something though? But another really resonant theme that came out for me, what you said was loyalty and betrayal, and like, what about when we move for first world rights? And how do we de-imperialize that kind of necessary migration, maybe? I'm thinking, okay, we need to think about that so much more intensely within the borders of this country because of our system of states' rights and what's happening with abortion access. So the idea of like, you don't like it here, you can move, or I need something over there, I'm going to cross a border. That's going to be that needs to be a feminist issue now. Needs to be a lot, just that consciousness needs to be a lot more alive in people's relationship to borders and identity and rights. So I think that, but the bigger issue that I love is the question of loyalty. How do we de-imperialize loyalty? Now I've been tried to be a lifelong polyamorous person. So I've done a lot of work at thinking about at least interpersonal jealousy. But I think de-imperialization means that we need to be allowed to start saying, like, not in my name, right? Like, I love my people, but especially in New York these days, when I see an East Asian face on the street or in the subway, I have a little physical impulse of solidarity. And I'll say that Kaman wants to take a portrait of the two of us. We're thinking about doing it. Kaman wants to do it in the subway based on that passage as a way to kind of recognize, but also challenge our own fear of being in the subway, with anti-Asian violence being what it is in New York City. And I'm thinking about, again, proximity to those tracks, right? How often Asian American history is associated with train tracks, and also South Asian diasporic, the idea of all the displacements that we've experienced, how many of them happen on tracks. So just the gravity of staging that photograph, I think that the future needs to be, we break solidarity on the basis of ethnicity and race. We understand that, that if there is a Chinese supremacist attitude, then I need to be able to imagine breaking solidarity with East Asians now, and what that's going to look like and how it's going to sound. And that's why the theory disappears into practicality, because I can say right now, I can preach right now, using theorists, but I don't know what it's actually going to look like. And conversations we'll have to have with Ken, So I want to maybe turn it back to you, because there's some, I know that Kaman staged the photo with you somewhere that was meaningful to you. And so.
Yes, we have been in a phone conversation before we decided to go for the photo shoot. And I believe it was Sunset Park area, somewhere in Brooklyn. I forgot the name of it because it happened like a year ago, last summer actually. And I told Kaman, when I first moved into, I'm taking you a little background story. 2020, during the pandemic, when I first moved into New York, I started living in Brooklyn, and we'll go for this. I'm always excited about grocery store as a public space, right? And it's like, not only there is different kind of social realities happen in different grocery stores. A co-op versus American grocery store versus I used to do this photo series on Chicago when I used to live there. Just going there, I was actually accused for shoplifting in the Asian American grocery store in Chicago. And that was very shocking to me because the person, I was obviously visibly a trans person or non-binary person that time. And the shopkeeper, they're all East Asian immigrant. None of them will believe that I haven't stolen anything from that store. Even though I have the receipt from the store I bought them, none of the item they carry in the store, but they harassed me. And that kind of triggered this the different dialogue on my head, like the safe space, the conversation, that the thing you said, like the breaking the solidarity, like who I am in solidarity with, what are the parameters of creating this solidarity. And grocery store as a space, I cannot assume by stepping inside a grocery store, this is somehow connected to my ethnic identity, right? So when I came to New York, I started touring all these different grocery stores because my first love relation with New York City was because of Jackson Heights. Because if I go to Jackson Heights, I can find every possible single Bangladeshi household grocery item there, right? And now New York has this multiple Bangladeshi neighborhoods all over New York. So I go there, I talk with them. And many of the communities are low-income immigrant communities. So there's a different kind of social dynamic and performances happening. When I go there, many times I will be perceived and treated as someone better than them because of my social presentation. As you said, like the people who are not, when I'm identifying as a non-binary, I'm college educated, I'm rather, if not like higher in income, but higher in social capital, perhaps somehow, for some reason, somehow I have more assimilation in the second generation diasporic community. And when I go there, I see that very different treatment of how they're dealing with my body. Rather being threatened or being bullied, I'm being treated as someone who is like them, but also like not like them. So there is like kind of in-betweenness. I'm like them. I am an immigrant. I came to this country, but I'm also not like them. They don't know where to place me. And that actually the reason I told Kaman I want to go to that Sunset Park, that outdoor fruit market, bazaar.
I'll share the image.
And I want to get photographed because of that. I didn't know like how to place my body on those ethnic grocery store spaces. Like I'm more, I feel like normally accepted, normal is a complicated word, but more accepted when I go to the America, like the regular grocery store, versus whenever I'm going to the ethnic grocery store spaces, like standing next to this tropical umbrella and the fruits, and we have multiple interesting experiences. Like sometimes we have to buy something in terms of being able to photograph ourselves. For people, like I'm not someone who's supposed to go randomly to this grocery store in this H&M dress and buy stuff from there, right? So then again, like going back to this understanding of not being able to place my body in a very regular, mundane place in our regular life, like a grocery store. We are not talking about anything exotic, like a bar or like a street or a shop or a hotel or something like that. This is the most mundane things can happen in your life, going to a grocery store for a regular task. But then again, there is tension between how you're perceived, how you're treated, how you're placing your body or not. So all these things triggered together. I gave you this long answer to do this photo shoot with Kaman at this Asian grocery store, Latino grocery store, in between all these wonderful dragon fruits and oranges and other stuff.
Yeah. I'm sorry you felt that happened to you. That's my reaction a lot now. And I think that knowing, anticipating, imagining the trauma and suffering that would lead to the reproduction of, violence and oppression within our communities that have been colonized. Okay, so I think what we do is we listen for that. We listen for what's said, and we listen for what's not said. We know what's not said. We know our people's history, so we know what's not said. So we listen for what's said, and then we're responsible for mirroring that back, both what's said and what's not said. That's all we can do, just mirror it back, right? That's what I'm thinking. That's like the movement, the gesture that I'm going for, because there are no words to diagnose that. I don't think there's a formula.
And the way you said, like, we need more text, we need more visual, we need more image, and everything we do, like including this conversation today, which is a very valuable conversation for me, like being able to document your thought process, your practice, your involvement with the community, and having that thing occupies some tiny amount of space in the virtual world. That existence is also very necessary, because we are always in dialogue among ourselves many times, I feel. So how can we channel it out in the outside world for them, for other, for some random person to come and consume and click a button and listen to what we have talked today's evening? Thank you.
That's a beautiful question. Well, can I say one thing in response? It's because I have a wall full of inspirational quotes.
Yeah.
And recently a colleague of mine said, I don't know, told me it's not your job to leave a zine out with hints, because I was like, we need to improve, we need to have this analysis out there. Why don't I like leave it, anonymously? And then she was like, that's not your job. I think we had this conversation for our pleasure, and I really we have to have more. Thank you for that. I think when the community calls, they're not going to call necessarily for our pleasure. I think they're going to call for our skills. And that's when we do the theory. We just do it. But I think, to be honest, like, it's this cycle of being drawn to the community, then you produce knowledge, but then you realize it actually has to be action. And people who stay in action, I think those are the activists. Not to say that we're not, but if you go back to the drawing board and you're back to research, you're back to a question, you're back to the theory, right? You're back to an engagement with the empire, you're back to the active, actually, that colonial confrontation or imperial confrontation again. If you're back to those ideas, I think that you are a artist, scholar, researcher. I think you're a researcher. I don't mean to bifurcate research and activism, but it's a cycle. De-imperialization of the ideas is a cycle. You don't need to keep worshiping the ideas. If you're called back by the ideas, then you have different work. I think.
I want to, I don't want to—
Please edit me. Yes, sorry.
I don't want to interrupt, I don't want to edit, but I want to finish with that beautiful analysis, articulation you just offered all of us, and end the conversation there so that we can begin the conversation again in another time, in another panel, in-person conversation over a dinner or something. But thank you so much, Stephanie, even though I mispronounced your last name. So, I'm sorry.
It's just a patronym. Who cares? Sorry, Dad.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining with us. And I hope we will have many more conversations in future.